I'm historian Alex Bevilacqua. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Renaissance support. A question from the Ask Historians subreddit. Seriously though, what actually is the Renaissance? The European Renaissance is a period in history when scholars and artists rediscovered culture of classical antiquity, of ancient Greece and Rome, and they created art that was inspired by the pagan past. And while the Renaissance began in Italy, it soon spread all over Europe. This was also a period, however, of political instability. Italy itself was fragmented. And so the Renaissance is also a period of warfare and great violence. New technologies, such as artillery, were transforming the battlefield, and new ideas, such as the ideas of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, were fragmenting Europe and causing new forms of division and conflict. From the history subreddit, we have, what event marks the beginning of the Renaissance? Great question. For this one, I'm going to need my trusty timeline. Because the Renaissance is a cultural and intellectual movement, it is hard to pinpoint a single date on which it started. In 1345, the poet Francesco Petrarch, goes to the Verona Cathedral Library and discovers a forgotten manuscript of Cicero, the ancient orator, and this starts the race to recover other manuscripts of classical antiquity. In 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire, and a new era begins in the Middle East. It's also when we have the development of movable type and of the printing press. In 1492, Columbus makes his first journey to the Americas. And in 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama arrives in India. And in 1517, Martin Luther makes his protest against the Catholic Church in his 95 Theses, which set off the Protestant Reformation. In 1599, the Globe Theatre in London is built, where Shakespeare staged many of his most important plays. When we periodize history, we usually say that with the end of the 16th century, the Renaissance era ends and the Baroque period begins. By the time we get to the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618, which is a conflict that involves all of Europe, we're definitely not in the Renaissance anymore. At Gata Graceful says, why is the Mona Lisa so popular? I literally don't give a f***. She's ugly. First of all, rude. To think of the Mona Lisa as the equivalent of a Renaissance pinup is the wrong way of approaching this painting. Leonardo's portrait of this wife of a Florentine silk merchant is one he worked on for much of his life. The Del Giocondo family who had commissioned it never actually received the painting, which was found in his atelier in France. The Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in history. So why is that? I'm going to give you two reasons. One has to do with Leonardo's technique, which is known as sfumato. He layered glaze over glaze over glaze so that all of the different colors blend into each other, so that there's no trace of the brushwork. Of course, this painting is completed after he's done his studies of anatomy, so he understands how the musculature of the lower face works. When he gives her that mysterious half smile, it's deliberate. Leonardo has his sitter almost completely still. She's immobile, and yet she's bursting with life. All we want to know is what she's thinking, and that is the power of Leonardo's portraiture, that he can convey so much interiority with so little motion. Now, if you go to the Louvre, you might be disappointed that you won't get a close encounter with a Mona Lisa because she is so popular. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., you can have an encounter with the first woman that Leonardo portrayed, Ginevra de' Benci, and you can have her probably all to yourself. Ginevra de' Benci called herself a mountain tiger. She was the original Ice Queen, as you can tell by looking at this painting, and getting to see it up close is one of the pleasures of the National Gallery. You can see Leonardo's brushwork, for example, the beautiful way in which the pearl hovers over her chest as it buttons together her very fine blouse. The Nintendo creator asks, what were common people's diets like in Renaissance-era Europe? Their diets were pretty terrible. The diet of an ordinary person would really have been based around a staple crop. In Europe, it was mostly wheat that would give them the calories they needed to get through the day. And this they would have eaten in the form of bread or perhaps gruel, which is a kind of porridge made with old bread. So not very exciting, not very delicious. Even the rich people were not eating many of the things that we consider characteristic of European cuisine. For example, the tomato is one of the many products that came from the Americas and that was not available in Renaissance Europe. So what even is Italian food without the tomato? Likewise, peppers, corn, squashes, avocados, also pineapples, and most depressingly perhaps, cacao, so no chocolate in Renaissance Europe. In addition to this, something that is essential to many of us, coffee, was not yet known in Europe. So all of the achievements of the Renaissance, they were all achieved without caffeine. Eventually, however, these goods start to trickle in, and they start to decorate the tables of, by the end of the 16th century, of elite households. And in 17th century art, we see many beautiful still life paintings that depict all of these rich and wonderful agricultural products that are coming into Europe from all over the world. At Foster Hunter Art asks, what hidden message does Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper hold? The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci is a fresco that is found in Milan on a wall of the dining hall of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Many people have read the Da Vinci Code and have developed conspiracy theories about this painting. Specifically, they think that the Apostle John, the youngest apostle, who's seated to the right of Jesus Christ, is actually a secret depiction of the Mary Magdalene. This is nonsense. The fact that John looks slightly androgynous is actually entirely characteristic of Leonardo's art. Leonardo painted androgynous, or we might say gender fluid, young men throughout his entire career. There's no coded message there. But there's a lot to love about this painting. For one, the use of linear perspective, the ability to make a flat surface seem like it has spatial depth. And this is something that was not practiced in medieval art, but he makes very elegant use of it here by centering all of the spatial lines in the painting on the face of Jesus Christ. Because this was painted on a large wall and Leonardo had to keep track of the design, he actually used a nail in the center of the face of Jesus Christ, and there's still a trace of it. He chooses a specific and very dramatic moment to depict, which is the moment immediately after Christ has said, "One of you will betray me." And what we see is the extraordinary psychological shock that ripples through the group of the apostles as they process this information. All of their different responses expressed with their hand gestures, except, of course, for Judas, who is leaning forward knowingly. The movements of the body convey the movements of the soul. OGSSX asks, if social media existed in different historical eras, which period would have the spiciest posts? My money's on the Renaissance. The Renaissance is an age of rivalry, first and foremost between different princes, between the courtiers who are competing for their favor at court. It's also an age of rivalry in the arts. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo famously did not get along when they were commissioned to paint two different walls in the same room in the center of Florence. So you can imagine how that went. The Medici are a family of merchants who become wealthy bankers. They're bankers to the Pope. They sponsor a lot of artists. And Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent in particular, is famous for living like a Renaissance prince. One of the artists who worked for Lorenzo, for example, was Sandro Botticelli, who's famous for The Birth of Venus. At Zerthezer says, can y'all art people explain to me why of all the great Sandro Botticellis, it's The Birth of Venus that seems to grasp pop culture by the neck? Weird. Well, it's true that there are many great paintings by Sandro Botticelli, but I think there's good reason that The Birth of Venus is one of the most famous. It is quite a sexy painting. So most of Botticelli's earlier paintings are religious scenes, Virgin Marys, and other saints. So this turn to pagan subjects really marks a change in the history of art. Venus is the ancient pagan Roman goddess of love, and she's emerging, according to myth, out of the waters, fully formed and being welcomed by a gentle breeze. In Renaissance Florence, there were sometimes debates about how much nudity was appropriate to be displayed in public places. So a painting like this would definitely have been for the inner rooms of a palace where only a select number of people would have been able to view it. At H. Lonella Tanda says, just realized the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were named after Italian Renaissance artists. That's right, Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, and Leonardo. Donatello is slightly earlier than the others and was a sculptor. Michelangelo is both a sculptor and the painter of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael is an exquisite painter who's a contemporary of Michelangelo's. And Leonardo da Vinci, of course, everyone knows as a painter, a draftsman, and engineer. Aristocrati from Reddit asks, is it true that during the Renaissance, some women used belladonna belladonna in their eyes for a dilated, attractive effect. Belladonna is a highly toxic plant that was used in the Renaissance, not so much to dilate the pupils as to make the complexion paler. Women in the Renaissance were obsessed with having pale skin, and they used a variety of means to make their skin more fair. Some of these were highly toxic, including lead, mercury sublimate, and arsenic. They also bleached their hair because of the importance of beauty in a patriarchal world. For many women, their marriage prospects were one of the most important determinants of their lives. When we laugh at them for these efforts, we shouldn't assume that they were always unaware of the side effects of the products that they used. And there are indeed some examples of women poisoning their husbands with their cosmetics, showing that they were extremely able both to understand that these were toxic chemicals and to put them to lethal use. Next question. @YaBoyDLG says, more important to mankind, Johannes Gutenberg or Steve Gutenberg? No shade to Steve Gutenberg, but I'm gonna go with Johannes here. Johannes Gutenberg is associated with one of the most important technological breakthroughs in Renaissance Europe, the printing press. Here is a small-scale model of a Gutenberg press. Printing had been known in China for centuries, but it was block printing. It wasn't printing with movable type. So the key breakthrough here is having different characters for each letter made out of lead that can be recombined. And this makes it much more economical to produce many, many pages of text in a short time. And of course, the abundance of paper, which again is a Chinese technology that becomes increasingly common in Europe. Paper is made by pulping old rags. It's made of underpants, if you will, and it's much cheaper than the animal hides on which people wrote earlier in the Middle Ages. The press itself is modeled on a wine press. This is where we would put the piece of paper, fasten it so that it doesn't move. Here, we would screw together all of our type so that it stays tight. Then we would place it and we would ink it. Using ink balls, it would be covered with the viscous ink and then rolled here under the press. And then the strongest man in the print shop would screw it down and make an impression of a page. And this process can be repeated again and again so that you can make many impressions of a single page. The very first book to be made with this new combination of technologies is Gutenberg's Bible. It imitates a medieval manuscript book in every possible way, including that they've had someone by hand decorate the initial letters. In the 50 years from the invention of the printing press, some 6 million books were produced in Europe in about 40,000 editions, which is probably more books than had been produced in Europe in the preceding millennium. One of the many effects of the printing press can be seen in the Protestant Reformation, which, starting with Luther's theses of 1517, relied on the ability of reformers to print out their ideas and to distribute them quickly. It almost became a form of Renaissance social media. Without the existence of print, it's hard to imagine that the new ideas of the Reformation would have traveled as widely or reached as many people as they did. @WonderboyGenius asks, wait, was MLK named after Martin Luther? Actually, yes. Martin Luther King Jr.'s father traveled to Germany as a Baptist pastor and was so inspired by what he learned about Martin Luther that he changed his own name and he changed his 5-year-old son's name as well. And it's not difficult to see why a Baptist preacher of the 20th century might have been inspired by the figure of the 16th century Augustinian friar that stood up to the Roman Catholic Church. Luther's Reformation came from a very deep spiritual insight, which is that works, that is good deeds, charitable deeds, are not what leads to salvation. It's faith that leads to salvation. And that undermines the whole edifice of pilgrimage and of indulgences and all of these ways in which late medieval Christianity was telling people that they could get to heaven. Luther's initial intention was to change the church from within, not to break from it. Over the course of the 3 years after he first published his criticisms in 1517, he realized that schism was inevitable. And this great division between Catholics and, as they were called by their critics, Protestants, led to wars of religion that lasted almost 150 years. @Vin Brown asks, what's with the sea monsters on old maps? If you've ever looked at a Renaissance map such as this one, you'll have noticed figures of fantastical sea monsters. The first thing to consider is that these maps were not made for navigators. These are maps for people who like to imagine distant places. So part of the function of the sea monsters is to make these maps beautiful. The sea monsters also tell us about ideas people had. The monstrous was a category of thought where people dumped things that they couldn't otherwise explain. This is a map of the Caribbean and of coastal South America. The people of the Americas were of extreme interest to Europeans. The Tupinamba people of Brazil were depicted here wearing feathers and engaging in an act of cannibalism because Europeans heard that cannibalism was practiced in Brazil. And this became one of their most enduring obsessions, even in relative absence of evidence of this practice. At JTalk says, OMG, the Sistine Chapel is unbelievable. A human did that? No way. Way. Many individuals collaborated together to make this splendid place of worship in St. Peter's in Rome. Of course, the most famous is Michelangelo, who painted the ceiling and the back wall. Michelangelo was a sculptor, and he was initially skeptical when approached by Pope Julius II, one of the great Renaissance popes, to paint the ceiling. He wasn't sure he wanted to invest that much time into this endeavor. He was famous in his time for his sculpture, including the David facing Goliath, depicted as a handsome youth, and that you can still visit in Florence. Eventually, Michelangelo was persuaded, and he painted a ceiling with scenes from Genesis that is still one of the most astonishing ceiling paintings that you can see anywhere, and that immediately sent out ripples through Renaissance Rome as other artists came to admire this work. The most famous section of the painting is at center. It's God creating Adam. Michelangelo suffered a lot to make this ceiling. He was up on a scaffolding. It used to be thought that he lay on his back, but we actually have a doodle that Michelangelo did in the margin of a letter to a friend in which he shows himself standing upright painting. Several decades later, in a very different political climate, he was brought back by a different pope to paint the back wall. That's when he created the Last Judgment, which is an extraordinary scene filled with hundreds of bodies. One detail that's worth noticing in the Last Judgment is St. Bartholomew holding his own flayed skin, because that skin is thought to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo. Jeskar from Reddit asks, in a Renaissance era world, what resource would be really important in trading and worth fighting for? We might think of gold or ivory, but the one that maybe is most important to consider is spices. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper from the Malabar coast, the south coast of India, cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. These were things that could not be produced in Europe and that had to be imported at great expense. They were transported across the Indian Ocean by Muslim merchants. When in the 15th century, the Portuguese start sailing along the coast of Africa and eventually reach India by 1498. One of the main reasons for their journey is to disrupt the spice trade, to cut out the middleman, the Muslim middleman, and to make themselves masters of this trade, which indeed they managed to do, and which leads to a period of Portuguese domination of the high seas and of global trade that connects Europe all the way to Japan. In order to be able to do this, the Portuguese had to make breakthroughs in open sea navigation. Vasco da Gama sailed out into the open ocean in order to be brought back by the currents. And that is also how the Europeans first ended up in Brazil, when they sailed out a little too far off the coast of Africa. This is the context for Columbus's voyage in 1492 and his subsequent ones. And of course, it begins a new era of colonialism. @BySilent asks, what is inside Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks? Da Vinci's notebooks are, to my mind, as much of a masterpiece as his paintings. Leonardo used his notebooks to put down things that he observed. Leonardo participated in dissections where dead bodies were cut up. This allowed him to study all of the organs of the human body, including, as you see here, a uterus with a dead fetus inside it. Leonardo believed that the human body was a microcosm of the universe, and nowhere is this idea better expressed than in his famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man, inspired by a passage in the Roman architect Vitruvius's book. What Vitruvius says is that the ideal human body can fit both in the perimeter of a circle and of a square, centered at its navel. Because the Renaissance was a time of warfare, Leonardo spent a lot of time imagining war machines. This is a machine surrounded by scythes that it can operate as it moves that will slice down anyone who comes near. He designed tanks and siege weapons and all kinds of other machinery, most of which was never realized. And in fact, when Leonardo did get a close-up look at warfare, the real thing, he thought it was terrible. Leonardo was also interested in the flight of birds, and he applied his insights to trying to devise a flying machine for human beings, mostly based on flapping mechanisms. Later in life, he designed some gliders as well. And here too, most of these machines were never realized. We have to think about them less as inventions and more as thought experiments, ways of trying to penetrate how aerodynamics work. Leonardo's notebooks are written in a very peculiar way, from right to left, in something that we call mirror script. Now, people have thought this was a code, that Leonardo was trying to conceal what he was writing. It has a simpler explanation. Leonardo was left-handed, and if he had written from left to right, the back of his hand would have smudged the ink on every line that he wrote. So he solved the problem by simply writing in the other direction. Here's a question from Quora. Was Leonardo da Vinci wealthy by the standards of the day? Leonardo was born the illegitimate son of a small-town notary. So no, he was not born wealthy, and as a child, he was apprenticed to a painter's workshop in Florence, where he had to learn his craft. A great way for a scholar or an artist to make a living in the Renaissance was to receive the patronage of a prince. Leonardo eventually moves to Milan and seeks the patronage of the de facto ruler of Milan. And he writes a letter, which we still have, which reads like a cover letter of a resume today, in which he lists all the things he can do. And 9 out of 10 of the main points pertain to military engineering, because remember, the Renaissance is a time of warfare. And Leonardo is saying, I can make astonishing machines, for example, for siege warfare that will help you and make you more powerful. And then after he's made this long list, at the very end, he sort of casually adds, oh, and by the way, I can paint as well as anyone else too. At Live2Tell says, does anyone know why Tupac keep referencing Machiavelli in his music? Tupac Shakur is just one of many admirers of Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat, historian, politician, who has become so famous in particular for one short book that he wrote called The Prince. His main argument is that the ruler has to be willing to be bestial, to do immoral things in order to hold on to power. In fact, even today, the adjective Machiavellian indicates someone who will go to any length in order to achieve their goals. Machiavelli, in fact, was a more careful thinker than that. He was not saying that we all get a free pass in immoral behavior. He was concerned with the fragility of politics in Italy during this time, and he was trying to offer a solution, not just for the prince himself, but for how stability could be maintained. At Before We Kiss says, wait, did Machiavelli and Leonardo da Vinci really team up? #superteam. Yes, this is the Renaissance equivalent of a superhero crossover. Machiavelli and Leonardo were in Florence at the same time, in the early 1500s, and both of them were serving the city government in different capacities. They collaborated on a project to reroute the river Arno, which flows from Florence towards the Mediterranean Sea through the port city of Pisa. Now, Pisa had been under Florentine rule, but it had rebelled. And so to punish Pisa, Leonardo Machiavelli thought it might be possible to do a gigantic project of hydraulic engineering and reroute the river. In the end, the project proved beyond the capacities of the Florentines and was abandoned. Here's a question from the Ren Faire subreddit. Quick, I need an outfit for the Ren Fair tomorrow. If you want to go to the Renaissance Fair and be historically accurate, here are some of the things to keep in mind. First, you need to choose a fabric for your clothing that was available in the Renaissance. Cotton was not widely available in Europe until centuries later. Wool in particular is what makes the fortunes of a place like England, which exports its wool, and of Florence, which processes the wool and turns it into fine and expensive textiles. The wealthy person would wear fine materials, wool shot through with silver thread, for example, or fine velvets and embroideries. By contrast, ordinary people might save money not so much on the fabrics themselves, but on the dyes that they use. Red, for example, can be obtained from madder. This is a cheaper but duller red, whereas rich people will use kermes, which creates a brilliant crimson. So the robes of the Holy Roman Emperor, which you can still see in Vienna, have a brilliant crimson. And the same is true of blue, which can be produced with woad, which is a cheaper dye, or the imported indigo, which makes a very brilliant blue. In the Renaissance, people expressed their social identity through what they wore. So a friar looked different from a duchess, who in turn looked different from a merchant. There was a lot of anxiety about the idea that if you changed your clothes, you might confuse people about who you were. So people passed sumptuary laws trying to regulate clothing. The other reason for sumptuary laws was to try to tamp down on luxury and to prevent especially women from overdoing it. As you may guess, these sumptuary laws were ineffective. People found ways around the regulations to express their status, to express their wealth, to express their love of color and ornament. Octavo 1 says, Leonardo da Vinci wasn't gay. People said he was as a joke. Leonardo's sexuality is something that people have speculated about for centuries. Leonardo surrounded himself with attractive young men, and he was himself a very pleasing, attractive, elegant person. It is said that he walked the streets of Florence in rose pink. Leonardo never married, and when he died, he left his property to some of these friends, these young men. All of the evidence suggests that these relationships were also intimate ones. And this is something that was not unconventional in Florence at this time, especially for an older man to have an intimate relationship with a younger one. It was something that was frowned upon, but nevertheless, it happened quite frequently. Having said that, in this time period, there's no concept of homosexuality as we might have today. And so it's always very uncomfortable to label somebody from the past with a concept that they wouldn't have used to designate themselves. At Viper 2024 asks, why is Nicholas Copernicus considered the father of astronomy? He can be considered the father of modern astronomy, not of all astronomy. Copernicus theorized that the sun and not the earth was at the center of the solar system. Until that moment, into the Renaissance, the predominant theory was that the earth was at the center of the universe, surrounded by the sun and the planets on fixed orbits known as spheres. Copernicus's model, which was published as he was on his deathbed in 1543, contains this diagram which shows the sun at the center. And he waits until he is very old to publish this. Nowadays, we talk about the Copernican revolution, but it wasn't a revolution in the 16th century. It's only really with the observations of Tycho Brahe, the work of Kepler and of Galileo, about 50, 60 years after Copernicus, that the heliocentric model of the solar system really erupts on the scene and changes how people think about the universe. Among the reasons why the heliocentric theory was so shocking is that it displaces the Earth and the humans within it. And it's a very humbling experience to be demoted from being in the center of a perfect universe to being just one planet in an imperfect one. The geocentric model lasted for such a long time because it corresponded to the way the world is described in the Bible. In the 17th century, Galileo famously said that religion teaches you how to go to heaven, not how heaven goes. From the Ask Balkans subreddit, what do you think about the fall of Constantinople and why do you think it fell? The city of Constantinople falls to the Ottoman army in the year 1453. This fall ends the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, and therefore a legacy that goes all the way back to ancient Rome. The Byzantine Empire was already weakened, had already lost many territories to the Ottoman Empire, which was a growing Muslim empire. The city itself was conquered by using all of the technology of siege warfare, including tunnels, including cannon, and of course, a very large Ottoman army. After less than 2 months, the city was overpowered. But this wasn't the end of the line for Constantinople. It flourished as the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Known nowadays as Istanbul, the Ottomans saw themselves as the inheritors of Rome, as much as the people of Italy did at this time. They called themselves Rumi, that is Romans, because they had conquered Rome. This is a 17th century pocketbook that you could carry with you to read in idle moments, and it is a description of the Near East for European readers. It focuses especially on the Arab lands, but it describes also travel to Jerusalem and Istanbul. And it's just one of many examples of Western European curiosity about the Ottoman Empire and the people of Islam at this time, from whom they knew they had much to learn. All we know art. How did Brunelleschi build a dome that defied gravity and defined the Renaissance? Filippo Brunelleschi designed the gigantic dome of the Florentine Cathedral, to this day still the largest masonry dome in the world. It expresses the ambition of the city, which was newly rich from trade. Now, Brunelleschi was given a huge engineering challenge. There was a giant octagonal space where the dome was to be built. To prevent the dome from buckling under its own weight, he surrounded it with what you could consider to be the equivalent of barrel hoops. So a series of rings inside between the two structures that hold it together and absorb that pressure. Second, he actually built two domes, not one. There's an inner dome and an outer dome, and this means it was much lighter. And finally, one of the big challenges here was how is it going to support itself while it is being built? He studied ancient Roman architecture and he noticed that they laid brick in a herringbone pattern. And so all of the brickwork is inspired by this Roman technique of herringbone. Because the herringbone pattern is much stronger than laying bricks flat, the brickwork sustained itself and didn't need to be supported till they were finally able to connect the brickwork at the top of the dome. Test 0314 asks, was Renaissance European hygiene really as bad as some say, and everyone walked around very unclean and smelly? This is a slightly unfair picture of the Renaissance world. People cared a lot about beautiful scents. They bought expensive perfumes, and they sought even exotic goods that would give them pleasant sensations. And the reason this was important was because they believed that disease could be transmitted through something called a miasma, essentially a bad smell. So smell was very important in the Renaissance because it conveyed information. It told you, is something healthy or unhealthy? The wealthy could surround themselves with fragrant gardens and have a much more fragrant lifestyle. Here's a question from the Ask Historians subreddit. Did people before the age of modern dentistry all have bad teeth? In the Renaissance, people cared about having beautiful teeth about as much as we do today. There were no dentists, however, in the Renaissance. If you needed a tooth pull, you went to your neighborhood barber, who was also your surgeon. The era before modern anesthesia, the best surgeon is the fastest surgeon, and the best dentist is the one who can pull your aching tooth the fastest and causing you the least amount of pain. Having said that, already in antiquity, people were making dentures and bridges to improve people's smiles and hide the gaps in their teeth. So too in the Renaissance, the barber surgeon Ambroise Paré, for example, makes a set of dentures for the French King Charles IX out of gold and silver. At Sorry It's Vic says, wait, was Shakespeare real? Shakespeare was a real person, and Shakespeare is also the person who wrote the plays. We have plenty of evidence both of Shakespeare's existence and no reason to believe that he is not the author of the plays. When we think of the Renaissance, we think first of Italy, but in fact, the ideas of the Renaissance quickly spread all over Europe. Shakespeare took inspiration from Italy and read about it. He even set some of his most famous plays there. The Renaissance was not just an Italian phenomenon, but a European one. It was a moment of cultural creativity, of new ideas in all domains of life that changed urban civilization all over the European continent at that time. So those are all the questions for today. Thank you for watching Renaissance Support.